All on you, Will.
All right, let's see what I can do here. Can you hear me?
Yep, coming through loud and clear, and slides are being displayed.
Perfect. All right, let me roll over and get set up. Thank you for selecting this. It's a nice dovetail. It's a great presentation before. Again, really appreciate you guys getting this set up. Given everything that's going on, it's good to have some social interaction however we can get it, right? All right, so digging into DFIT. That's a newer term, and we'll get to that. Basically, like Hidden Cobra, which is a far cooler name than what I've got for digging into DFIT, is the enemy inside the organization. Little introduction, I'm Will Baggett, certified collection exploitation engineer, certified fraud examiner, iOS exploitation. I've worked for CIA, worked for NATO. I'm working for a consulting firm working with Big Pharma right now. And what is DFIT? Digital forensics as applied to insider threat. That's a little bit newer element, but it's not an external element trying to hack in. It's a person who might be inside the organization looking to do some harm. And I've learned the way that the way we identify it isn't so much the traditional threat actor, the threat intel. It's more of a collaboration with leadership, with management, with human resources. And with some of the investigations we've been through, look at three factors. The human factor, that's first and foremost. The technical collection and analysis, and the forensic gaps. Just because we've got 100 different desktops, 6 servers, that doesn't tell us anything until we sit down and work with our client, human resources, security, to figure out what exactly is the issue. Why have you consulted to us? What's the problem? What are you trying to prevent? And a little bit of the standard watch list from human resources would be new hires. This is all new to me. Being in CIA, everything was compartmentalized, locked down, stovepiped. Working now in the private sector and seeing the breadth of data availability is like drinking from a fire hose. Generally, when you have a new hire, you just want to make sure they know what they're doing. They're not sending out Coca-Cola's secret formula to Pepsi by mistake. If you have somebody give 2-week notice, we want to make sure that they're not taking everything that's sensitive with them on the way out if they're starting a new business. Sometimes in larger organizations, if somebody's on a performance improvement plan, if they have a severe performance drop, human resources might notify the SOC to say, please monitor this user's identification, his O365. Let's see what he's doing or she's doing for the next few weeks to see if this is an anomaly for the behavior or if this is a pattern we need to be concerned about. Level of access, like we've seen with a gentleman named Edward Snowden. Whether it's your DFIT team yourselves with the unprecedented level of access they have, SOC employees and network admins, like the watchman, who's watching the watchman? You have to have an external group monitoring your people with the most trusted access. Life issues, if you have somebody who's just had something horrific happen, lost a lot of money, medical bills, whatnot, depending on the organization, if you're working for a financial firm, that might be of interest to have them on, I hate to say watch list, that has a negative connotation, but observing the behavior to see what they're sending out. If they're sending out sensitive PDFs, encrypted PDFs, or what else is going on. What else is going on? I'm sorry, I've had a Coke energy drink and those are fairly well caffeinated. One last thing that we're gonna look at is impending layoffs or bonuses that are being cut. You may have somebody in the organization that's a little bit bitter and they would take the opportunity to say, well, if I'm being laid off in 6 months, I'm going to do some damage, start my own business. And with forewarning, working with a SOC, you can change the DLP, digital loss prevention filters, to see what data is truly being sent out of the organization by individuals at risk. So we have the list from HR, from leadership. The secondary list that we work off of in the SOC is going to be people who repeatedly violate this. They keep sending out sensitive key documents that say proprietary, confidential, internal use only, whatever metric is set to the firewall filter that would flag this alert. The traditional elevated access. If they keep asking help desk for access to a SharePoint they're not in that group for, something that just doesn't sit right. It's the same security principle, but just applied to the internal filters. Access violations, does this user continually try to connect to a USB? Are they trying to map a drive to box.com? Are they trying to have shadow IT installing Slack chat or any of the other thousands of apps out there where data can exfil without your knowledge? So we take those two sets and we'll monitor to see what's happening as a proactive measure. In some of the cases, though, we'll take the fraud triangle. This a little bit odd being virtual. I'm used to raising hands and having a little bit of interaction. The fraud triangle comes from the fraud examiner certification, where this definitely makes sense to a group of InfoSec and engineers out there. If somebody knows they're going to be laid off, it's never their fault, right? It's never their fault. But if somebody knows they're going to lose their job, they're going to have financial pressure, and the rationalization would be, I'm going to be short this much income for the next so many months until I have a new job. They owe it to me. I'm entitled. And this is the hallmark of the fraud examiner certification, is being able to notice when an individual is under this pressure where they might take extraordinary steps in the organization to better their own means at the expense of the organization. So one of the biggest things, just like any other Active Directory, is you want to control the access if at all possible. If you know somebody's at risk, you cut their access. And this starts to shape down the insider threat when we do the endpoint forensic analysis, whether it's with Encase, Axiom, Blacklight, what have you. We're going to have a better focus as to what the individual is into, the access they have, shouldn't have. And as examiners, we're going to have to work closely with security, with human resources, with the manager of that employee, because there's no way we can possibly know, is this normal for their job, or is this out of character? So we'll take those principles and apply some of the traditional counter-espionage principles from any good Jack Ryan book or from any Tom Clancy novel. The traditional acronym was MICE: money, ideology, conscience or compromise, ego or excitement. Why would this person who's worked for Acme Incorporated for so many years now start to embezzle money? Why would they start to sell our secrets to the opposition? You go down that list, and in the late 90s, CIA came out with an updated list for motivations of why somebody might commit espionage, why they might betray the organization they're with. This updated list is called RASCALs: reciprocity, authority, scarcity, commitment or consistency, liking, or social proof. The person could be simply socially engineered to provide the data. Hey, that's great, you're working with Widget Incorporated. I don't think you're getting paid enough. Show me some of the advanced drawings, the advanced techniques you're working with. And then when you get hired by our company, we'll know to be able to pay you more. There's never another job offer. It's just a way to get data socially engineered out of the corporation, whether it's espionage or business intelligence. It's usually the same methodology. So turning from the machine itself and then turning from the human and then looking at the machine, how would they get this data out of the organization? And it becomes very simple. I'd look for a good GIF, we should have a vote on that, as to somebody squeezing a balloon or squeezing dough. When you squeeze on one side and apply pressure, something's going to come out the other side. So if they're using a USB because the SD card's locked down, okay, well, we've locked down the USB and the SD card. Is Bluetooth enabled? Can they connect a device to Bluetooth and like AirDrop and remove data that way? Are they going to use web email? Are those sites banned through your firewall? Or do you even have digital protection on your firewall to keep an employee from mailing out documents or PDFs? If that's locked down, you have somebody like, I believe it was Reality Winner in 2016, 2017 in Augusta at an NSA site. The traditional Russian spies, Hansen and Ames, just taking out burn bags full of printed documents. So they didn't bypass the digital protection. They just took the printed take and walked out the door. That bypassed one. And that's a different level of DFIT, well beyond this speech. The last thing to look at is more of what we're encountering now is the chat and shadow IT. And that's where a little bit of the bulk of this talk comes about, is how are people able in 2020, when they can work, to get data out. The three newer methods we're looking at from my time with Operation Safe Escape as an engineer helping those who've been digitally stalked, we can use the Apple logs, we can use the Google Takeout logs, and then on the corporate side, the Slack logs. We know, again, this would be great to have face-to-face interaction, but most of us have either used iMessage, Google Chat, or Slack for one method or comms or the other. And from these are not foolproof. And I'll get into that as well, but I want to give the caveat. This is a list from Gaggle.net of all the chat programs that children are on to warn teachers that here's another method of communication. Just because you might have those three locked down at your organization, iMessage, Google Chat, and Slack, here's probably 50 to 60, 70 different chat programs that you might need to consider having these locked at the firewall as well. Your standard former government caveat, this talk can't cover every chat log for the thousands of files out there. If you find one, ask about it, search for the outliers. Now, using Axiom, you can connect to the cloud with the right adapter. I believe this is the cyber plugin. They donated a license to Operation Safe Escape, which is fantastic of them. So the three that we've used would be Apple Data Download, Google Takeout, and Slack for our investigations, which is great. This gives you access to everything. The Twitter didn't quite give us at the time the direct messages, so that could be a gap that somebody could exploit. Of course, you see the checkbox. You do have to have their permission, their consent to download this. If it's a corporate environment, they would know if you've downloaded the Google Takeout, there'd be an alert, so you could download it after they've resigned or been terminated. They wouldn't know, but if you download it during the employment, they would have an idea that they're under investigation. So you have to use discretion for that. So loading, this isn't an Axiom ad here, but you do want to pre-configure your takeout for your for your Axiom. And I always want to get the screen captures because that's one of the easiest way for people to steal data is take multiple screenshots and label it something like kitchen renovation, crawfish recipe, whatever. That way it looks like an innocuous name and you're not aware that the screenshot is actually in the document named something else. It's hidden data. Not pure steganography, but close to it. From here, I would look at Google Takeout, see where they're logged in, where am I able to just sync data among my different devices. But Google Takeout doesn't have the be-all, end-all storage that we initially thought did on our first investigation. Our client had a G Suite account, and deleted data is available unless it isn't. That's not a typo. Because they had a 503C account, it was basically a free account. Deleted Hangout chats, that's one of the main points of this talk, weren't available because they didn't pay for the full license from Google, as well as the Google Vault documents. If they deleted the files from the Google Vault, the data was removed from the forensic take using Axiom. And if there was a private chat between user A and user B, we were not able to see that because it was deleted, and because the license wasn't the level, I'm choosing the words carefully. The license didn't have the option to retain Google Takeout data, Google Hangout chat data, as well as the Google Vault data. That was lost, which is as good as not having it whatsoever. So if you do have Google Takeout enabled for your corporation, you have to make sure that it's either not retaining data for HIPAA violations or HIPAA compliance, or if you do have to retain it for SEC compliance, you have to manually verify this data will be retained for 10 years plus 1 day to meet the legal requirements. Again, I'm not an attorney, check with your attorney for this. But by default, deleted data under Google Takeout isn't necessarily retained. This will give you a little bit of the idea of some of the data available from Google Takeout. It is comprehensive. In the NATO Special Operations course on mobile forensics, we were able to show the students how they can log into a Google Data account for previous students and see where previous soldiers had taken the phone's full pattern of life. Even though the phones are wiped, they're still able to recover the data. And that gave a good impression as to the data that is retained. But the gaps, just because we have a Google Takeout download doesn't mean we have everything. And that's, again, one of the things I want to convey to the community is there are some huge gaps in this. There's a lot here for Google download. This is a file. This file was 30 gigs. A couple of things here: Google Pay, Google Receipts, which are great to see. Did they buy extra storage space above and beyond the organization? Are they hiding data there? That was great. One thing to please, for the love of God, log out of your Google account before you have your nasty YouTube playlist videos at work. We don't want to see it. We really don't. It'll be okay if you log out, or just don't do it at work. But the volume of what's recorded for the analyst to see is phenomenal. Now, Google Vault, there are some hashes, there are some splits as to what is retained, what isn't. You have to intentionally go in to set this to retain the documents and the Google Takeout chats, if that's what your organization requires. But again, by default, these are not retained. There's nothing we can do as forensic analysts if it's not available from download. The next big one, this is also pay to play, is Slack for the JSON files. So the organization had 50 users. It was a year worth of chat. It was only 22 megabytes of data. That doesn't sound like much, but it was all just text, no true files in there. It was a lot of data. So when we say digging through the DFIT, that involves the human angle for the interviews to find out what exactly happened, the life events, when did they get put on a PIP, when did they get put on a PAR or a PAR adjustment, so you can hone in to see exactly what happened before and after that incident on the JSON files, because otherwise you're completely lost in the minutia. A couple of key things here from being a fraud examiner: you want to have two-person control over Slack. A person can open just be a member, and unless you have explicit control, they can create new channels, have private channels, and delete those channels without the account holder being privy to this data that comes and goes. So again, purchasing the full version of Slack will give you the ability to retain that data and then to examine it after the fact. But if you just use the free version, once that end user deletes the channel, deletes his messages or her messages, that is not recoverable. Even if you pay Slack now, they can't go retroactively recover that data. And that's another key takeaway for this, is if your client hasn't paid for the full version, you may not receive that data, period. That's a huge vulnerability. So from here, we can see there's almost 17,000 Slack messages for 47 users, 23 channels. One of the things we did parse through was left the channel, terminated the channel to see after the person was laid off, terminated, what have you, to see if they still had access, because if you have a shadow IT style environment where someone's created a Slack for team collaboration without formal documentation or approval, they might still be able to get drop copies of the organization's fundraising events, bank account information, anything they would have in the normal life, unless you know to remove them from that channel, because again, it's shadow IT, they're still going to get data for this. One beautiful thing about using Axiom, you're able to bring in the different types of accounts. So I've got Google Takeout, Apple's data download, and Slack. And from this, you can see the anomalies over here of, okay, there's one CSV document, one Excel document. I didn't put it up, but there was also one that said it was an encrypted document. Well, out of this one case had close to 1 million files. And once we got done sifting and filtering based on the conversations with human resources and security, there was only one encrypted file out of 1 million. That anomaly was rose up, and we discussed with the client, what's in here that makes it so sensitive that they had to share it, the one of them, literally 1 million file, why this one? And this did give us some granularity sifting through the figurative haystack of data. I'm wearing my Apple hoodie as from Apple headquarters. I give the presentation. It's on my LinkedIn page. Aside from what I have to have for my client, I have a complete Apple environment at the lab here. There's a difference between the iCloud data for download and the Apple data download you get from me.com or iCloud.com. And there's an important distinction in the two. The Apple download that you would get from Axiom, you'll have whatever the user has synced up to the cloud. You're going to get the media, the photos, maybe the chat messages. You'll get all the email going back to the date they opened the account, which is fantastic for e-discovery. You may or may not get map information. It depends on what's been synced. The Apple backup data is where I believe the gold is going to be for the forensic analyst. This has the data for when did this device connect to the network? What was the IP address? What date did he connect to Game Center? What date did he connect to iMessage? That's not data the end user can modify. It's just like going into Splunk. It's a little bit tough. Well, actually a lot easier than Splunk, but this is going to be what we use in Safe Escape to see, are there multiple users on this account? Has my victim been hacked? That's available right now in Apple backup data, but not available through Apple iCloud data through Axiom. That's a big distinction. That's a talk on me I need to flesh out for later. So quickly rolling through this, if you go to iCloud.com, you can request a backup copy of your data, and this is the data that you would get: marketing communications, bookmarks. I'll roll through this a little bit quickly. Device information, what device is logged on to the account. You don't get that from the iCloud backup through Axiom. This would be directly from Apple at iCloud.com. Apple Pay activity, Apple Care, of course, to see if you're in warranty. The calendars are a great source of data. We were able to parse through and see every 2 weeks the people we suspected of exfiltrating data from this organization had an iCal set up for running meetings using something like a Blue Jeans or a Come Meet Me or Go Meet Me or Meet Me Here, or whatever the heck. But they had something to remind them to go out of bandwidth for their meetings because they were starting a new company. And we found that clue because the iCloud calendar was still available showing the data. This is how the data would come back. It's all CSV files, the Apple ID, Game Center, iCloud, iTunes, the online store. This is a little bit older data pool, but the data is still accurate there. And from this, you're able to see, I'll own this, I'll blame this on my kids, but you're able to see these are the ads that were pushed to their devices. And then from this, you're able to see what devices they clicked on. And it looks like my kids downloaded the Obi-Wan Kenobi game back in 2018. One last place to look for data for the incident response for insider threat is going to be the principal. On the admin side of things, one of my party tricks I like to do when I was training NATO troops was to walk over in the SCIF, the classified environment, and just hit reprint all on some of the printers. And then the one place up in Canada, it was literally a ream of paper, 500 pages plus of everything previously printed by that organization. And the object lesson was, I don't have access to your system. I don't have clearance to your system. But I, as an attacker, just walked over, hit reprint all. Now I've got access to 500 pages of what you've done. I didn't touch it, didn't break any laws. The abject lesson was anybody could hit reprint all and walk out, and you wouldn't know the insider threat has occurred. So you want to make sure the printers aren't retaining this data, because looking at what this organization is providing me, working with this pharmaceutical company, I've got Celebrite, Axiom, Blacklight, Encase, and I wouldn't be able to tell what was reprinted off a printer because that would be out of scope of our network. That wouldn't fall privy to what I can discover. A couple of easy things on a Mac. If you go to var spool cups under sudo, the files that, this is the principle, the files that start with C are going to have the metadata. The files that start with D are actually PDFs, and you can restore those to the desktop to see what was printed. So if you run a strings command on a file name that starts with C, you'll get the metadata to see what file was printed, which is a good idea if you're looking to see everything someone walked out of an organization with. This is a great way to recreate the principle if you have access to the Mac. A couple of thoughts to leave you with. We would always say, if it ain't in cable traffic, it ain't. If it ain't documented, it ain't. So as we're doing this large investigation and interviews with the client, our best practices being remote and dispersed from each other, especially now, document the events and the interviews as they happen. If person of interest A gets divorced, has this, changes last names, changes first names, if there's any name change, ask up front if there's any life events you need to know, because that would be key as you're doing an investigation. You know, Joe Blow and Jane Blow might be the same person if you don't know those are two pointers to the same ID. Document files as they're discovered. For these larger cases with 1 million plus pieces of data to sift through, if you see something of interest, document it, put it on SharePoint, talk to your team. Don't think you'll come back to it later, because you probably won't. Before you start your investigation, as you have FaceTime, that's a precious thing now. Have an SOP for sensitive files before investigating these documents. Okay, if we find evidence of bank accounts, if we find evidence of donor files, of proprietary formulas, I hate to say it, CP. At what point, who do we call in this consulting environment? Who do we contact? What do you want us to do? Because these are trip lines. Where do we raise the red flag regardless of day or night? Never assume. Some of the investigations have had developers that we are investigating, and they've had esoteric files that I definitely thought looked like malware, but they were approved developmental tools for the organization. But conversely, Slack and Google Takeout weren't approved by the organization. It was shadow IT that had been involved. Last quote comes from the book Moscow Rules. It's about operating in Moscow. Never been there, but once is an accident, twice is a coincidence, 3 times is an adverse action. As you're going through the insider threat forensic response, somebody can click on something 1 time as an accident. Twice is a coincidence. Emailing something 3 times to yourself at home, there's definitely a pattern that should be investigated. The key takeaways: identify the key dates prior to any investigations. That's more of police work, counterintelligence work than it is anything SANS or incident response. But when you're dealing with the human factor of insider threat, the dates are going to be precursors for the adverse actions they have. Mind the gaps in the collection, knowing now that Slack direct messages that can be deleted can't be recovered. We're able to say, here's a blind spot where they stop chatting overtly. There's no chat, then they resurface, referencing a private chat, but it's not there. Now we know why it's not there. No matter what we do, it's not going to be recovered because there's a gap in this. Lastly, just like any good collection, document the events as they happen. Don't be afraid to ask questions, because the one question that might not make sense to you might be the key for the investigation for human resources or for security for your client. So with that, any questions, comments, concerns?
So there was one item in chat, Will. I don't know if Frichtemann wants to elaborate on it, but something about the Q key system as a best practice for Slack. It's in the chat. I don't know if someone wants to elaborate on the question or if you understand precisely what that's getting at, Will?
The 2-factor authentication for Slack?
I think so.
That's definitely a good thing. You know, I'll never say no to 2FA, but again, if the organization hasn't set up Slack to be used, that's still a problem regardless of how they're getting in.
Okay. I guess for admin, so you can't accidentally delete channels, just a follow-up comment.
Right.
Okay. Oh, I see. So 2 admins as a rule for functionality. So sort of like a
Right.
2-person integrity item.
Right. Going back to my ancient banking days, but you wouldn't have one person count the cash and then say, yes, we're supposed to have $500,000 in the branch. I've counted it. It's all there. You'd always have somebody else check it.
Yeah.
Same thing here. You don't want to have one person as the admin knowing he's going to lose his job. Now he's the admin who can delete things. Maybe not the best practice. You want a disinterested third-party admin to oversee the channels who frankly doesn't care. He's just, here's your channel. It's up. Thank you very much. Simple.
Okay. Yeah. So I think that addressed things. Any other questions in the chat? I'm not seeing any. If anyone has any last sort of rounds, otherwise we'll wind this up.
I will say that Operation Safe Escape, if you know of anybody who's in a domestic violence situation, you can get help at safeescape.org, or if you'd like to volunteer, help at safeescape.org. Just say, I'd like to volunteer for the effort, and it's a basically international effort of I can't talk, of InfoSec professionals helping victims get away from their abusers. Just something as simple as turning off iMessage so it's not shadow drop copied on multiple phones. Might be all it takes so the bad guy doesn't know what's going on with the abuse victim.
Understood. There was another question that popped up in the chat. Wouldn't it be better to do DFIT using user and entities behavior analytics?
Yes, if they have it. Some orgs have it. The huge pharma company I'm consulting to has it. Some organizations don't.
Okay, that seems fair.
The one organization, the 503C, 503B, they didn't invest in getting the full G Suite in the full Slack. They didn't have 2-person oversight, and a lot of money went out the door because they didn't have the oversight, because they didn't spend the $5 a month per user. They lost that oversight.